Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya, and today we talk about the trial of Thomas Sankara's killers. Yemen, whose exiled president has ceded power to a new leadership council, and the possible ripple effect of the workers' union formed at Amazon growing support for a union at Starbucks. A landmark 3-month trial of the killers of 37-year-old Burkinabe revolutionary Thomas Sankara has come to an end. The trial ended with the conviction of Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's former comrade-in-arms. Compaoré and his former head of security, General Gilbert Diondere, were charged with complicity in murder, concealing bodies, and harming state security. Compaoré's former security chief, Hyacinthe Kafando, has also got a life sentence, though still at large. He led the soldiers who killed Sankara. Several of the killers are still at large. Compaoré was president until a popular uprising in 2014 when he fled to the Ivory Coast. Ivorian authorities rejected a request for his extradition to Burkina Faso. Still, over 100 witnesses appeared, and those found guilty have been given various punishments from life in prison to 20 years. Sankara was brutally assassinated on 15 October 1987. We have Anish from People's Dispatch here to tell us more. Anish, can you tell us more about the trial and how it came about that it happened now?
Yeah, so as you rightly pointed out, Compaoré was in power until 2014. So there was absolutely no chance until then for any kind of judicial process to initiate, for obvious reasons. And then after that, there has this demand to actually bring to justice what happened. The assassination, as we know, was also a massacre because there are 12 people died that day along with Sankara. And that is something that was never really investigated or brought to trial. Sankara's family has been asking for justice ever since, while they were in exile, and after that, after Compaoré, they were talking about exhuming the body, examining it, doing the post-mortem that has been long delayed, which they did eventually in 2017 when the exhumation of the body happened, and they found like more than a dozen bullets in Sankara's body. So a lot of that happened primarily because of the democratic movement that emerged in 2014, the popular uprising that went against Compaoré and his decades of neoliberal policies that actually affected the country far worse and reversed a lot of the legacy policies and institutional changes that Sankara had actually brought about in the 80s. Among other things that happened is the former president, who has now been deposed in January, as we know, by another military coup. His attempt to actually bring about a national reconciliation, because what we need to remember is that Sankara's assassination was also a coup that actually really brought the country into a standstill in many ways, because it was a step backwards rather than forwards. It was actually undoing a lot of changes that actually made and affected a large number of population. We're talking about a country that had something like close to 21% infant mortality, which was brought down very drastically under his 4 years or 5 years in power. And other than that, the strides that were made in women's liberation, expanding healthcare, expanding contraception, considering very seriously the AIDS pandemic that actually affected a large number of the people as well. So a lot of things that were undone, and even the nationalizations that were undone of land, of estates, that were undone by Compaoré, really affected a large number of people. And he also had this, Sankara was a legacy in itself. We have to remember it was not just the presidency. His revolution also meant a new hope for African people across the continent. It was we are talking about the 80s. We are also talking about the time when South Africa was still fighting against apartheid, when other parts of the continent were also going through different kinds of struggle against colonial and neo-colonial struggle. So his death really marked that sort of shocking step backward that really affected a lot of people.
Now in the present time, can you tell us what Pan-Africanism has come to mean? Because that's one of the things that
Yeah.
he represented.
It is quite a difficult thing to talk about because, in many ways, after Sankara, there were very few people who really spoke about this concept of Pan-Africanism, and not just as a concept, but as a political project to
Right.
bring together the continent of Africa. Uh, Obviously, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa advocated for that, but over time we have seen how that has been sidelined by the current political elite in South Africa. Muammar Gaddafi was one of the exponents of the political project. He actually really went for it throughout his lifetime. But after the whole debacle that happened in 2011 with NATO invasion, even that has taken a big setback. And so we are not very sure where that is. It still animates a lot of political discourse, as we know, in large parts of South Africa. Not South Africa, but most of Africa and the African continent. And in that, we can also see the kind of popular reaction that happened when the indictment happened last year against Compaore and Diendere and all the other people who who are now convicted of Sankara's death. And the conviction as well, the responses that came across Africa, not just from political leaders, but also from people itself, who saw, as I said, saw Sankara as this big, great hope for them. And it was not just this one country of Burkina Faso, but it actually affected the mindset of millions. So it is still there somewhere. It is just that the political project really no longer has that vehicle to bring it forward, or a massive vehicle that actually existed in the form of Sankara, Gaddafi, or the earlier forms of the African National Congress, and so on. So where it stands today is a very tricky question, and that is something obviously African leaders really need to answer. But it definitely is a hope that somehow still exists in the political imagination of the continent.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Anish. Anish will be back with you in just another minute or two. A comeback for the union seems to be on the horizon in the United States. Employees at 3 outlets have voted in favor of forming unions, which will bring the number of total unionized outlets to 13. Starbucks calls its employees partners, and it has said it does not need a union between them and itself. But it has also announced higher wages, raising the hourly rate up by $3 in order to prevent unionization. It also does not seem to have distracted the workers from their demands. Some newspapers say that unions at Starbucks could be the start of a national movement, and that McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts could be next. We'll go back to Anish for a little more on this story. So, Anish, we're talking about tens of thousands of workers who work isolated in different cafes. So, what could have brought them all to think about getting together?
Well, actually, we need to set a background because we need to understand, like, for the past 2 years at least, workers' movement have actually gotten a new lease of life during the pandemic, obviously, but also because of other political mobilization and social mobilizations that we saw, especially with the George Floyd protests and other kinds of student movements and workers' movements that happened. We need to remember that United States is still debating it's been nearly a decade now that they're still debating the $15 per hour wage bill, which is yet to be passed at the federal level. There are hardly any states that are actually, and the deadline for the $15 per hour thing, where it can be considered as a living wage, as a livable wage, is actually set to pass in the next few years. So it is really at that stage where workers have been pushed into a sort of brink, and the pandemic obviously affected a large number of them. So the workers' mobilization really just exploded at this point. So it created a sort of, it not just isolated, but like a large wave of, one, a pro-unionization movement, secondly, demands for better contracts and better fair contracts and better working hours. And finally, also to address the deep-seated racial and gender inequities that exist in workplaces across the country, obviously in every sector, but also definitely for the working class people, the low wage workers who are largely people of color, mostly Africans, but also migrant workers, Hispanics, and other national minorities that exist in the United States. So in this context, the work that has happened in Starbucks, the new 3 unions that has been formed yesterday or were voted by the workers were actually a culmination of years of work, not only by traditional trade union movements, but new trade union movements that have come across, mostly independent, who are actually no longer going for just passing laws and waiting for legislative reforms to happen, but are actually taking their cause in their own stride and pushing for it in whatever form that they can actually go for.
Can you just go into a little more detail about the effect that COVID had on workers? They tend to be typically young workers, but also you mentioned the BLM earlier. So what are the connections really that the people might be drawing?
Yeah, so one of the things that were highlighted during the Bessemer Amazon warehouse, when the unionization drive was one of the major national highlights in the United States at that point. And it still is. It's going to go into the second vote because the first vote was considered ineligible because of the company's interference and union busting methods. That aside, during that time, it was highlighted how the anti-racism movement, the movement against police brutality, against killings, against racial inequalities, actually also highlighted the deep-seated economic and the material realities that black people have to face, and that primarily comes from the fact that a large number of them work in these various kinds of informal sector jobs, where they are considered as contractors and not workers. A lot of especially the younger ones, who will not be eligible for any kind of labor protections, who will not be considered for even minimum wage guarantees in most cases. So these people really wanted to go for a better, fairer contract system. And so what happened in Bessemer, what happened in MIT right now, which also voted for, MIT graduate students voted for a union just a couple of days ago, and other places where new unions are coming up in IT sector, in delivery work, among delivery workers, among restaurant chains across the country. And this obviously a lot of the trends are very similar. They're looking, as I said, looking for fair contracts, minimum wage guarantees, and labor protections. But also at the same time, the need for labor mobilization as workers, as a class, is coming back in the picture, because for decades the neoliberal policies that United States, successive governments in the United States have brought in, have actually depleted the labor movement to less than 10% of the organized workforce. So in that sense, this coming back is definitely also marking a new era of politics in many ways, because it is tying a lot of other factors, social and political, and creating a new movement actually in many ways for workers' movement.
All right, Anish, thank you very much for that. Abdrabu Mansoor Hadi has irreversibly delegated his powers to the Presidential Leadership Council. Hadi, who had been living in exile in Saudi Arabia since 2015, also announced that the council will talk with the Houthis for a permanent ceasefire in Yemen. The Houthis have called it a desperate attempt to rearrange the ranks of mercenaries who are fighting in Yemen. Saudi Arabia has welcomed Hadi's announcement and pledged $3 billion for Yemen, some of which is to be paid by the UAE. We'll speak with Abdul from People's Dispatch about this development. Abdul, how does Hadi's announcement affect the situation in Yemen?
Well, we don't know, but one thing is clear. Houthis have been demanding Hadi's removal for quite long, since the beginning. In fact, their struggle started primarily against his rule in 2014, when they argued that he is basically working in collaboration with the foreign agents or foreign countries like Saudi Arabia and US and other countries, and he's been following corrupt practices which is harming the Yemeni people. So with that background, they started the movement in Yemen. So you can say that this was the primary, Hadi was the primary concern of Houthi movement in the beginning. In that way, they have welcomed it, that this is a welcome development, that Hadi finally is gone. But whether this will affect the larger war situation in Yemen or not, I think it's too early to say, given the fact that there is already a ceasefire which has been agreed. And I think this, the removal of Hadi has come with that particular understanding that if you want, Saudi Arabia-led alliance has realized that if you want to continue the ceasefire to make it permanent, you need to kind of deliver on certain central concerns. So, as we discussed in the earlier meetings, earlier in this show, I think, that Houthis have demanded removal of blockade. They have demanded the ceasefire, ceasing attacks on Yemen by the Saudi Arabia-led coalition and the withdrawal of forces. But removal of Hadi was one of the central demands. So you can say there is a positive development vis-a-vis the demands raised by the Houthis in Yemen. So it may affect the ceasefire situation. It may prolong the ceasefire further. But whether it will ultimately bring peace in the country, I think it's too early to say.
Okay, so, but this was also a very expensive war. Could it be that it is Saudi which is trying to protect its interests now?
Of course, they want to get out of this war for quite long. But they need some face-saving mechanism so that they can legitimately say that, okay, we did what we came to do. So they have the Riyadh dialogue, which is ongoing, and in that particular platform, this development of creation of presidential council happened, in which they invited all the factions who are basically there in in Yemen, along with the Houthis and other. So if you see the composition of the presidential council is, there is a representative from, I think, all main factions, including the Southern Transitional Council, which has been fighting for a separate South Yemen. And then there have been representatives of the Islah Party, which is opposed to, which has basically, you can say, not opposed to, but kind of there is a disagreement between Islah's objectives in Yemen and UAE, which is one of the key allies of Saudi Arabia-led war in Yemen. So they are also there, and of course there are other smaller factions which are part of that presidential council. Houthis are not there. So even if Saudi Arabia wants to get out of it without considering the significance of Houthis in Yemen's politics today, that this particular move will not have much effect. So yeah, it looks like that Saudi Arabia is looking for a way out of this war, and this creation of presidential council may help in that endeavor. But again, I will repeat what I said in the just now, that it's too early to say that. Why? Because until Saudi Arabia agrees to basically withdraw its forces or the forces of its allies from the region, agrees to kind of the basic Houthi demand of creating a united Yemen in which all the those factions who have fought against it will have a kind of some kind of balancing role to it, and it addresses the question of the issues of minorities, the issues of other major concerns, the war crimes which have been committed in last 5 to 7 years basically. So although until those issues are addressed to some significant level, I think Saudi Arabia will not find it easy to get out of it. The legitimacy of the Riyadh conference or the dialogue which is happening in Riyadh at this moment is under question, because the major party of the war is not there. So even if you come out of that, if you want to come out of that war, you will have to kind of make it look like much more legitimate, which requires much more effort. Just to kind of bring it into the light, the airstrikes have not stopped. The blockade of Hudaydah port or the blockade of Sana'a airport has not been completely lifted. So there is a partial lifting, but it is not completely lifted. So these concerns remain. So even if Saudi Arabia wants to get out of it, it is very difficult to do it at this moment.
All right, Abdul. Thanks very much for joining us. And that is all we have today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow, and please visit www.peoplesdispatch.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram.